Hey there, I'm Shannon Ballard, the creator and host of Southern Mysteries. This is an independent podcast made possible by the core support of patrons who appreciate stories like the one you'll hear today. I want to say thanks to new episode patrons Emily Smith of Rembert, South Carolina, Levada Roberts of Vidalia, Louisiana, and a warm welcome to new patrons who are supporting from mysterious locations, Katie Gregory and We Will Survive. A big thanks to you for your support. If you are new here and you want to join these wonderful folks in helping me create Southern Mysteries, you'll receive access to the first 3 seasons of the podcast, which are available exclusively on Patreon. Additionally, you can choose a support level that grants you access to even more stories, including my monthly patron podcast, Audacious, which focuses on some of the most shocking stories and scandalous crimes in American history. You can join Southern Mysteries on Patreon and get immediate access to listen to more content now at patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. Or if you already have the Patreon app, just open it up and search for Southern Mysteries Podcast. It was just before midnight on October 15th, 1890, when gunfire shattered the stillness of Girard Street in New Orleans. Police Chief David Hennessy staggered toward his front door, wounded and bleeding, while alarmed neighbors rushed outside. Before losing consciousness, Hennessy spoke a few final words that would spark outrage, deepen divisions, and set the stage for one of the darkest chapters in New Orleans history. Welcome to Southern Mysteries, exploring Southern history and true crime. I'm your host, Shannon Ballard. This is episode 173, The Forgotten 11 of New Orleans. Nothing about David Hennessy's evening suggested it would end in violence. On October 15th, 1890, the police chief left a meeting at City Hall, stopped briefly by his office to tidy up paperwork and speak with men on duty. Then he stepped out onto the damp streets of New Orleans. Rain had fallen hard earlier that day, and the night air was heavy. Outside, Hennessy ran into his close friend, Captain William O'Connor of the detective force, and the chief suggested they share a meal. The men walked to an oyster saloon on Rampart Street. They settled in, ordered a dozen oysters, and Hennessy washed them down with a glass of milk. When they left the saloon, the friends parted ways, O'Connor turning in one direction, and Hennessy towards his home on Girard Street. Just before midnight, as Hennessy approached his house, the quiet was broken by the sound of shotgun fire. Several blasts tore through the night, striking Hennessy. Accounts differ on how many men lay in wait. Some said 3 or 4, others claimed as many as 7. Hennessy stumbled but managed to pull his revolver. He fired into the darkness before collapsing to the ground. Whether or not he struck anyone, the chief had at least tried to fight back. Captain O'Connor was still close enough to hear the gunfire and rushed to his friend, who had been struck several times. Hennessy was gravely wounded, gasping for air. O'Connor leaned in, told his friend to hold on for help, and asked Hennessy if he saw who fired the shots. The chief's reply has been debated ever since. Some later swore he used a slur for Sicilian immigrants. Others insisted he simply whispered, "Tell my friends goodbye." Whatever those final words truly were, by morning, the city's newspapers had already seized on the more incendiary version. Hennessy was carried home, where doctors worked through the night to save him. A priest was summoned to administer last rites, and at 9:06 the next morning, Chief David Hennessy died. He was just 32 years old. Hennessy's murder shocked New Orleans, but his reputation meant the city was already primed to take sides. David Hennessy was no ordinary policeman. Born in New Orleans in 1858, he had joined the force while still a teenager and built a reputation as a fearless and ruthless man. At just 21 years old, he and his cousin, also a police officer, became entangled in a bitter feud with another patrolman, Thomas Devereaux. Tempers flared, a confrontation turned violent, and Hennessy shot Devereaux, dead. He claimed it was self-defense. The jury believed him. For some, that verdict proved he was a fearless young man who wouldn't hesitate to protect himself. To others, it was proof he lived above the law. Hennessy's notoriety only grew. In 1881, he helped capture Giuseppe Esposito, a Sicilian immigrant who fled to New Orleans after he was accused of banditry and murder in Italy. Returning Esposito overseas to stand trial earned Hennessy national attention and cemented his reputation as someone willing to confront what newspapers described as the Sicilian underworld. By the time he was appointed New Orleans police chief in 1888, Hennessy had powerful allies and bitter enemies. Among rival factions in city politics, among criminals he pursued, and the city's growing Sicilian immigrant community. In the mid-19th century, impoverished workers from Sicily began leaving the countryside in search of survival. The unification of Italy brought crushing taxes that left the poor with two choices: starve or flee. By the end of the century, more than 4 million Italians had immigrated to the United States. Many chose New Orleans, where the booming sugar and cotton industries promised work. By 1890, Sicilians made up roughly 1/10 of the city's population. The French Quarter became so heavily populated with immigrants that locals called it Little Palmero. Italians owned or controlled more than 3,000 wholesale and retail businesses, with their labor shaping the city's economy from the docks to the markets. But their success also bred resentment. For the city's old guard, families who had long dominated politics and commerce, this industrious immigrant group was seen as a threat. Many Sicilians kept to themselves, intending to return home after earning enough money. That distance from the broader city fueled suspicion, and in a city where race was a defining line of power, Sicilians occupied a complicated place, not fully accepted as white, and often lumped together with Black Americans at the bottom of the social order. Newspapers seized on that prejudice, sensationalizing stories that painted Italians as criminals and conspirators. Every rumor of mafia connections, every petty crime involving an immigrant, was magnified until the entire community was branded suspect. By the time David Hennessy was gunned down, tension in New Orleans was at a breaking point. His death became the spark that turned fear and resentment into open violence. Mayor Joseph Shakespeare, already outspoken about Italian immigrants, publicly framed the killing of Hennessy as the work of Italians and pushed for sweeping arrest. Shakespeare ordered police to round up Italians found on the streets after the shooting, a signal that the city's leadership was prepared to treat an entire community as suspects. The Board of Police Commissioners placed Captain John Journey in temporary command of the force. Journey's role was to steady the department and oversee the dragnet that followed. Mayor Shakespeare ordered Journey to have every officer arrest every Italian they had come across, many with little evidence against them. New Orleans police raided homes in Little Palmero, pulling men from their beds. More than 100 men were taken into custody and interrogated for hours, some even for days. Shakespeare and Journey had to admit that little evidence tied these men to Hennessy's murder. Most of them were released, but a good number remained locked in the city's jails, kept there on suspicion over fact. The working theory inside City Hall was that Chief Hennessy had been killed by a criminal society transplanted from Sicily, striking back in retaliation for his efforts to break up their counterfeiting rings and vendettas. Police officials insisted that most of the crimes in New Orleans were being committed by Sicilians, whose feuds supposedly spilled into the streets and saloons of a stretch of the city nicknamed Vendetta Alley. Hennessy had investigated those disputes for years. One of the families he focused on was the Provezanos, who at the time of Hennessy's murder were awaiting trial for murder. The morning after Hennessy's death, one paper carried a notice urging citizens to, as they worded it, gather to assist the officers of the law in driving the murderous mafia from our midst. Mayor Shakespeare appointed a committee of prominent citizens to look into the supposed secret society blamed for Hennessy's death. They called themselves the Committee of 50, and their mission was to investigate bands of assassins and devise the most effective and speedy measures for their annihilation. The murder of the city's police chief became the excuse many officials had been waiting for. For years, they had watched Italians arrive in New Orleans by the thousands, dismissing them as peasants and criminals. Now, with Hennessy dead, they seized the moment to accuse the entire community. Dozens of Italians were thrown in jail. From the moment they were locked behind bars, they were threatened with violence if they did not confess. The Committee of 50 even ordered reporters not to speak with the prisoners or publish what was happening inside the jails. But the press refused to ignore the story. In fact, newspaper headlines fanned the flames of fear with stories about a Sicilian conspiracy and hinted at a shadowy mafia pulling strings in the city. In 1890, the word mafia was still unfamiliar to most Americans, but the press ran with it, fueling suspicions that New Orleans had been infiltrated by criminals from Sicily. By early 1891, 19 men, most of them Sicilian immigrants or first-generation Italian Americans, were indicted. In February 1891, 9 of them stood trial for the murder of David Hennessy. The proceedings quickly revealed how weak the case against many of the accused truly was. Witness testimony contradicted itself. Some of the key evidence was circumstantial at best. Jurors heard that Hennessy had recognized his killers as Sicilians, but even that statement was muddied by conflicting reports of Hennessy's final words. When the verdicts came down in March 1891, the courtroom erupted. Several of the defendants were acquitted outright. Others saw their cases end in mistrials after the jury couldn't agree on a verdict. For those in the gallery, especially members of the city's political elite, this was seen not as justice, but as a complete failure. The morning after the verdict, New Orleans woke to headlines that sounded more like battle cries than news. Editorials in the city's newspapers condemned the jury and fanned the flames of outrage. One newspaper went so far as to call on citizens to take justice into their own hands. And that call did not fall on deaf ears. By early on the morning of March 14th, men began to gather near the parish prison, where 19 of the accused Italians were being held. The crowd grew quickly, from dozens to hundreds, and then thousands. The Italian consul in New Orleans asked Louisiana Governor Francis Nichols to step in and prevent an outbreak of violence. The governor refused to act without a request from Mayor Shakespeare. Shakespeare's team sent word to the governor that the mayor had gone out to breakfast and could not be reached. The growing crowd near the prison included everyday citizens drawn by anger or curiosity. But it also included powerful men, politicians, judges, lawyers, and businessmen who had come not to calm the crowd, but to lead it. Among them was John Wycliffe, a well-known attorney who roused the mob with a fiery speech. Other prominent figures joined in. Their presence gave the gathering the appearance of legitimacy, and it wasn't long before the meeting turned into a march. The mob surged toward the prison, chanting and shouting for vengeance. The main entrance of the prison was heavily guarded, but nearly 24 men gained entrance and made their way down its corridors. Some accounts say guards who were loyal to Hennessy moved aside and allowed the mob to enter. The guards had reassured all of the Italians being held in connection with Hennessy's murder that they would be safe behind the prison walls, protected until the legal system could decide their fate. But it became clear the law was no longer in control. The mob had come for blood. When the prison warden realized what was happening, he made the decision to open the doors to the cells and allow the Italians the chance to escape. But the men were frightened and unsure of where to go or where they could hide. Some of the men made their way to the women's wings of the prison, hoping the mob would avoid searching for them there. But as the mob continued to enter the prison grounds, they spread out, searching everywhere, until they tracked down 11 of the prisoners. The crowd outside the parish prison swelled, with estimates ranging from 6,000 to 8,000 people. Gunfire rang out. Ropes were thrown over beams and tree limbs. By the time the mob's anger was spent, 11 men were dead. Antonio Bagnetto was a sailor who was tried and acquitted of Hennessy's murder before he was killed by the mob. James Caruso, a longshoreman, was killed with 5 others near the entrance to the women's side of the prison. He had been arrested, but was never tried for Hennessy's murder. Caruso had filed papers towards citizenship in 1886 and was registered to vote in New Orleans. Loretto Comitz was the only non-Sicilian among those arrested and accused in the Hennessy case. He was a tinsmith who never stood trial. Rocco Girisi, a stevedore, had a criminal history, but was never tried for Hennessy's murder. After he was shot to death in the prison, his family sued the city of New Orleans for failure to protect him in custody. J.P. Misciacco was a fruit merchant and leader of the New Orleans Italian-American community for the Regular Democratic Organization. He had been tried and acquitted of Hennessy's murder before he was shot and killed. Antonio Marchesi was a businessman and community leader. The widower had recently arrived in New Orleans with his son, who was arrested with his father. Antonio's son survived, but after having declared his intention to become a U.S. citizen just days before the Hennessy murder, Antonio was murdered at the prison. Pietro Monasterio was a shoemaker who had arrived in the United States in January 1890. Until he was swept up in the mass arrest in late 1890, he had worked and sent money home to his wife and 5 children. He lived in a shack near the site of Hennessy's murder, which led to his arrest. The judge declared a mistrial in his case, but Monasterio was still being held and was shot to death in the parish prison. Emmanuel Polizzi was a street vendor who had been tried for Hennessy's murder, but his case ended in a mistrial. He was referred to as a man who suffered mental challenges and paranoia. Frank Romero had lived in New Orleans since 1859 and was naturalized in 1868. He was active in politics and had worked as a farm laborer and cigar dealer. He died in the prison, having never stood trial for Hennessy's murder. Antonio Scafidi was a fruit peddler who had been in the U.S. for 10 years when he was arrested and tried in Hennessy's case. The judge declared a mistrial, but he remained in prison, where he was shot and killed. Charles Trena was never tried. He was a laborer and lemon dealer. With no known family in America, his body was never claimed after he was shot to death. They were fathers, sons, husbands, and brothers. Some had lived in New Orleans for years, building businesses and families. Others were recent arrivals, hoping to make a life in America. None of that mattered when the mob broke through the gates. The killings took place in broad daylight. Some men were shot where they stood inside the prison. Others were dragged into the street and lynched before the roaring crowd. The violence wasn't hidden, it was witnessed and celebrated by thousands who claimed they were avenging their fallen chief. The morning after the largest single mass lynching in American history, the front page of the New York Times read, "Chief Hennessy, avenged." When Mayor Shakespeare was asked if he regretted the killings, he replied, "No, I am an American citizen, and I am not afraid of the devil. These men deserved killing, and they were punished by peaceable and law-abiding citizens." No one who participated in the mob that day would ever face justice. But the victims, these 11 Italian immigrants, were denied not only justice, but the dignity of being remembered as men, not as symbols of fear or headlines in papers across the country. When the violence was over, their bodies lay in the prison yard, in corridors, and hung from trees outside the walls of the prison. 11 men were dead, their lives taken not by the justice system, but by a mob that believed it had the right to decide guilt and deliver punishment. In the days that followed, many of the city's most powerful citizens celebrated the lynchings. Newspaper editorials applauded the killings as a righteous act. Some headlines praised the mob for doing what the courts would not do, while others called it the will of the people. For them, vengeance was justice. But beyond Louisiana, the reaction was very different. The Italian government was outraged. 11 of its citizens had been murdered on American soil after a jury had acquitted them or a judge had dismissed charges against them. Rome demanded accountability. When it didn't come, Italy recalled its ambassador and broke off diplomatic relations with the United States for more than a year. At one point, the crisis brought the two nations to the brink of war. President Benjamin Harrison, unwilling to provoke further outrage at home by condemning the mob, offered only measured words of sympathy. Eventually, his administration agreed to pay an indemnity to the victims' families, a sum meant to ease tensions, but one that did little to answer for the horror of what had been done. For the families left behind in New Orleans, there was no justice. Widows grieved in silence, and children were left without fathers. In the city's cemeteries, the men were buried together, but even in death, they were remembered less for who they were and more as symbols of an immigrant community that had been vilified and brutalized. The killings did not bring closure to the murder of David Hennessy. They did not settle the questions about who had truly ordered the chief's assassination. Instead, the lynching left a permanent scar on the city, one that revealed how quickly fear and prejudice could outweigh truth and the law. For more than a century, the story of the 1891 lynchings was all but forgotten, left in the shadows of New Orleans history. And for generations of Italian Americans whose families lost fathers, brothers, and sons that day, the silence was a wound that was passed from generation to generation, a wound that would never quite close. In Italy, the impact lingered as well. The murder of Chief Hennessy and the killings that followed marked one of the first times the United States faced a serious diplomatic crisis over a domestic act of violence. It wasn't until the 21st century that the city of New Orleans began to publicly reckon with the violence of 1891. In 2019, New Orleans Mayor LaToya Cantrell gathered with Italian-American leaders and representatives from the Italian government. She issued a formal apology on behalf of the city, acknowledging the injustice and the hatred that fueled it. She told the crowd what happened to those 11 Italians. It was wrong, and the city owes them and their descendants a formal apology. For the families who had carried this story quietly for generations, it was a moment of recognition they had waited more than 100 years to hear. What happened in New Orleans in 1891 is remembered as one of the largest mass lynchings in U.S. history, an attack driven by fear of immigrants, resentment of outsiders, and the dehumanizing power of prejudice. The story of David Hennessy's murder and the violence that followed remains unsolved. The truth about who killed the chief may be lost to history, but the lynching that came after tells its own story. It warns us of what can happen when fear becomes more powerful than justice, when anger drowns out truth, and when an entire community is judged not by who they are, but by what others believe them to be. The echoes of that October night in 1890 and the tragedy that followed in March 1891 are still with us. They remind us that history is not just a record of what happened. It's a mirror, asking whether we will confront the darkest parts of our past or let them remain in the shadows, waiting to repeat themselves. Southern Mysteries is created and hosted by me, Shannon Ballard. As always, you can find sources for this episode in the show notes here in your podcast player or at southernmysteries.com. If you're enjoying this show, you can help others discover it by rating and reviewing Southern Mysteries on the platform you use to listen. That would help out a lot because it helps other true crime and history fans discover the show. If you want to dive deeper into Southern Mysteries, you can access the show archive of the first 3 seasons. It is available. It's just not available to everyone. It's only available to Southern Mysteries supporters on Patreon. Your support helps cover the cost of research and hosting the show, which I manage on my own without any support. This is a completely independent podcast with no supporting staff. When you become a patron, you'll gain access to exclusive content that's not available anywhere else. Additionally, by supporting at the Much Obliged tier, you can enjoy my monthly Audacious podcast, which features stories about some of the most shocking and scandalous crimes in American history. If you have the Patreon app, you can search for Southern Mysteries to learn more and support my work, or you can go directly to patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. You can join today and start listening to stories you haven't heard before right away. Thanks for that. And as always, thank you so much for listening to Southern Mysteries.